Welcome to City Vision University's podcast, providing book summaries of books on rescue missions, city missions, and the Salvation Army. So, I want you to imagine something. Let's say you break your arm, right? You go to the doctor, they take an x-ray, and the film is completely clear.
Right. There's that jagged white line right across the bone.
Exactly. You look at it, the doctor looks at it, and you both know exactly what's wrong. And more importantly, you know exactly how to fix it. It is entirely binary. It's either broken or it's not broken.
Yeah, put a cast on it, keep it still, and you're done.
Right. But how do you diagnose the breakdown of a human life?
Right.
I mean, when you step into this deeply complex world of neurodevelopment or severe trauma and profound generational poverty, that diagnostic x-ray machine is just useless.
Oh, completely useless. The landscape is incredibly murky. It's never just one isolated problem.
Exactly. And that's what we are getting into today on this deep dive.
Yeah.
We are looking at a landscape that is just incredibly muddy because for over a century now, there has been this fiercely independent network of rescue missions wading right into those exact muddy waters.
Doing the really messy, unglamorous work.
Yeah. The heavy lifting of urban rehabilitation that, frankly, massive government agencies often they can't quite figure out. So today, we're exploring how a system that was literally born in the 1700s is somehow outperforming these modern, multi-billion-dollar bureaucracies.
It really is the ultimate diagnostic challenge because, like you said, the problems these independent institutions are trying to solve, they're never just a lack of calories or, a lack of a roof over someone's head.
Right. It's not just, here's a sandwich, now you're fixed.
Exactly. If you treat homelessness or addiction like a broken arm, like you just put a cast on it, give the person a meal, and send them on their way, you fail completely. And we see that failure a lot.
We really do.
So what we're looking at today is the operational DNA of Evangelical Rescue Missions in the United States and Canada. And we are drawing really heavily on Arthur Bonner's foundational research and his historical analysis to really understand how these highly localized autonomous centers actually rehabilitate human beings.
And honestly, the stakes here are universally relevant for you listening. Whether you work in urban policy or psychology, or even if you're just trying to understand the fabric of your own city, these missions act as these incredible living laboratories.
Yeah, they're the ultimate testing ground.
Right. They're testing ground-level solutions to the absolute most complex behavioral and structural crises in our whole society. But to really understand how they operate on the streets today, we actually have to rewind the clock.
Way back. You have to look at the philosophical bedrock.
Exactly. And to do that, we actually start by looking at a major political flashpoint from back in 2001. It really highlighted the unique position of these missions.
Yeah. The early 2000s were a really pivotal moment for this entire space because President George W. Bush had just proposed this massive push for federal funding directed specifically at faith-based social ministries.
Oh, wow. Right. I remember that.
Yeah, and it instantly ignited this total firestorm of debate across the whole country. I mean, regardless of where you fall on the political spectrum, left, right, whatever the central tension was all about the separation of church and state.
Because critics were terrified of blurring those lines.
Exactly. People were asking, should public tax dollars flow into institutions that have very explicit theological motives? It's a valid question. Can you actually build a rigid wall between secular social welfare and religious conviction when you're dealing directly with extreme poverty?
And the fascinating thing to me, the thing that really stood out in the source material, is that the rescue mission's answer to that question wasn't formed in 2001. It was actually formed in the 1700s.
Right, by John Wesley.
Yes. John Wesley, his teachings are literally the absolute DNA of the modern rescue mission. There's this core philosophy of his that just completely reframes how we think about charity.
The concept of social holiness.
Exactly. Wesley stated, and this is a direct quote from his teachings, that the gospel of Christ knows no religion but social, and no holiness but social holiness.
That phrase, social holiness, is really the key that unlocks this entire historical movement. Because Wesley wasn't just speaking metaphorically, He wasn't sitting in some comfortable study writing theoretical papers.
Yeah, he was out there.
He was completely enacting this philosophy physically and geographically. So let's look at April of 1739. Wesley took what was, at the time, an incredibly radical step. He actually abandoned the traditional church pulpit altogether.
This was unheard of back then.
Totally unheard of. He walked out to the highways in the open fields adjoining the city of Bristol, and he preached directly to a crowd of about 3,000 working class and completely destitute people.
Wow. 3,000 people.
Yeah. He was taking this message of deliverance, of healing the brokenhearted, directly to the people who were completely marginalized by the polite society of that era. Field preaching became his defining methodology.
But he didn't just stay in the fields with the poor, which is what I actually find the most compelling part of his story. He also took this fight directly to the epicenter of wealth.
Right. The confrontation in Bath.
Yes. So a few months later, around June of 1739, Wesley travels to Bath. Now, to understand what Bath was like in the 18th century, you have to picture the absolute zenith of English high society.
It was the place to be.
Oh, it was like the Hamptons, Beverly Hills, and the Met Gala all rolled into one single city. It was where the ultra-wealthy went to see and be seen, to gamble, to socialize. And the undisputed king of this whole scene was a man named Richard Nash, known as Beau Nash.
Oh, Nash, the ultimate socialite.
Exactly. And when Nash heard Reslow was coming to preach to these elites, he publicly proclaimed he was going to shut him down.
Because Nash represented the ultimate manifestation of this comfortable, detached wealth, right? He physically confronted Wesley right there in Bath, and he demanded to know by what authority Wesley dared to preach there.
He actually accused Wesley of frightening the upper classes out of their wits.
Yeah, but Wesley completely stood his ground. He didn't flinch at all, and the philosophy he was pushing wasn't just about theology in a vacuum, it was really about economics.
How so?
Well, Wesley wasn't some monk advocating that everyone take a vow of poverty. He actually taught right living, steady habits, and hard work. But his critical caveat, the part that made him so disruptive, was that the wealth generated by these habits must be used for moral ends.
Yes, he was looking right at these early, incipient capitalists who were building immense fortunes, and he was demanding that they take responsibility for the people at the absolute bottom. He was basically forcing cross-class interaction.
He really was.
Because when I look at modern charity today, it often feels like, well, a polite hobby for the wealthy. You buy a $1,000 ticket to a gala, you wear a nice tuxedo, you write a big check, and then you drive back to your gated community.
You never actually see the problem.
Exactly. You never actually interact with the person receiving the help. So Wesley, showing up in Bath and disrupting the polite society of the 18th century, it feels like the exact moment charity stopped being a tax write-off and became a mandate to look poverty right in the eye.
It was a demand for proximity. Wesley recognized that true social holiness requires you to close that physical and relational gap between the wealthy and the destitute.
Right. You have to be in the room.
Exactly. And if you look at the modern landscape of social work, today's rescue missions are one of the very few environments where that forced proximity actually still happens.
That's a great point.
These are places where men and women literally reach across the immense gulfs of wealth, class, and ethnicity. It's not just a transactional transfer of funds from some foundation to a shelter. It is a forced daily interaction between people who have mastered the capitalist system and the people who have been utterly crushed by it.
So if that social holiness and that demand for forced proximity is the philosophical blueprint, what does the actual architecture look like? I mean, structurally, because when you look at how these missions operate today, they stand in massive contrast to the giant charitable organizations that totally dominate our cultural imagination.
Oh, the contrast is absolutely staggering. I mean, when the average person thinks of a Christian charitable organization, their mind almost immediately goes to the Salvation Army.
Right, the red kettles at Christmas.
Exactly. And the history of the Salvation Army is fascinating in its own right. In its very early formative years, it was almost exclusively focused on street preaching and conversion, very grassroots. But toward the late 1880s and early 1890s, operating in places like London and New York, they began opening physical food and lodging depots. And once they crossed that threshold into owning physical infrastructure and coupled it with highly sophisticated national fundraising campaigns, the Salvation Army mutated into an absolute behemoth.
And calling it a behemoth is almost an understatement based on the numbers in the source material. The scale they achieved is just mind-boggling.
The numbers are huge.
Yeah, by 1903, the Salvation Army was nationally supplying an average of 137,000 lodgings and over 365,000 meals every single month.
Every month. That is massive.
Right. And during the Great Depression, they took this massive industrial building in New York and completely refurbished it into something called the Gold Dust Lodge. That single facility, one single building, could house 3,500 men and feed 10,000 people.
That is basically industrial-scale assembly line charity. It is highly centralized, highly standardized, and intensely organized.
It's the Goliath of the sector. The Salvation Army operates with this top-down command and control structure. They literally use military ranks, right? Majors and captains.
Right.
But the rescue missions we are examining on this deep dive are the complete opposite. They are the David in this scenario. They don't trace their lineage back to a single denomination, and they definitely don't answer to some massive corporate headquarters.
No, they consider themselves the outreach arm of all local Protestant churches, which is why you'll often see them named Union missions, like the Union Gospel Mission.
Their defining structural characteristic seems to be this fierce, almost stubborn independence. Every single rescue mission has its own independent local board of directors.
Yeah, they are entirely autonomous. There is a fellowship network, though, the Association of Gospel Rescue Missions, or the AGRM. At the time of this research, it boasted hundreds of member missions across the U.S. and Canada, around 294 members.
But they aren't pop-up charities, right?
Oh, no. A huge percentage of them have been operating continuously for over 50 years. In fact, many of them have been open for over a century.
Wow, over a century of continuous operation. But it's vital to understand that this AGRM network is not a governing body.
Correct. They do not dictate policy, they do not set standardized procedures, and they definitely don't control the local funding. They act more as a resource and networking hub.
So what holds them all together if not a corporate charter?
The connective tissue between these hundreds of independent missions is really a shared adherence to the mandate found in the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 25. The verse that says, "For I was hungry, and you gave me something to eat. I was a stranger, and you invited me in." That verse is literally their decentralized operating system.
I love that analogy. It's the difference between a multinational franchise and a local diner. If the Salvation Army is like a massive global coffee chain where the procedures, the branding, and the menu are absolutely identical whether you walk into a branch in Manhattan or Tokyo.
Right, you always get the exact same cup of coffee.
Exactly. Then these rescue missions are fiercely independent local coffee shops. They all serve coffee, or in this case, emergency shelter and rehabilitation. But the exact flavor, the rules, and the atmosphere are uniquely tailored to the specific crises and culture of their immediate neighborhood.
And that hyper-local governance creates an incredible set of strategic trade-offs. The clear disadvantage of this massive decentralization is a total lack of institutional leverage.
Because they aren't a unified, multi-billion-dollar corporate entity.
Exactly. They don't possess massive lobbying power in Washington, D.C., and they don't have a synchronized national PR machine to shape public perception. But, and this is but the advantage is absolute agility.
Agility is so critical in this work.
It is. A centralized bureaucracy takes years to pivot its strategy. But an independent rescue mission, governed by local business owners and faith leaders, they can recognize a new crisis on their streets on a Tuesday and completely restructure their outreach by Friday.
But that hyperlocal reality also forces them to confront some very complex sociological truths, particularly regarding demographics. Because the underlying theology of these missions is strictly colorblind.
Right. They view every single person purely as a child of God.
Which traces all the way back to Wesley, right? He was famously a fierce abolitionist and denounced American slavery in the absolute strongest terms. However, having a colorblind theology while operating inside a highly racialized society creates tension.
Oh, it's a profound tension. Because of their theological stance, many missions historically resisted keeping official demographic statistics based on race. They just didn't want to categorize people that way.
Which makes sense on a spiritual level.
It does. But the sociological reality, which is heavily documented by journalists embedded within these programs, is undeniable. In many long-term recovery programs, depending heavily on the city they're in, anywhere from 20% to as much as 80% of the population are African Americans.
Right. You can hold a colorblind theology, but you simply cannot ignore the realities of redlining, generational poverty, and the specific targeting of minority communities during the war on drugs and mass incarceration.
You really can't.
Because these missions are governed locally, they are absorbing the direct, localized fallout of systemic, racialized inequality. If your specific zip code has been absolutely devastated by the crack epidemic or over-policing, your mission has to build programs that address the specific trauma of the people walking through your front doors, regardless of your overarching theological ideals.
And that necessity for hyperlocal adaptation is precisely what forced the rescue mission model to evolve so dramatically over the last century. I mean, they didn't start out with these complex psychological and vocational campuses we see today.
Far from it.
Yeah, they started in the absolute gutter, dealing with a very different type of crisis entirely. So to understand where they are now, you have to look at the genesis of the movement, starting with a man named Jerry McAuley in the 19th century.
Jerry McAuley is such an incredible historical figure. He is widely recognized as the pioneer of the entire rescue mission movement. And he wasn't some pristine upper-class philanthropist coming down from the hill.
No, not at all.
He was an ex-convict. He was a man intimately familiar with the criminal underworld. He opened the Water Street Mission in New York, operating roughly between 1839 and 1884.
And his philosophy was incredibly grounded. He believed his job was to clean people on the outside, literally wash the dirt off them, while trusting God to clean them on the inside.
Yeah, and he deliberately placed his mission in the Fourth Ward, which was an area known for immense squalor and drunkenness, because that was the world he personally came from.
And the physical reality of those early missions was astonishingly austere. I mean, they operated on almost zero resources. Consider the mission started by Colonel George Clark and his wife Sarah in Chicago in 1877.
Okay, what did that look like?
Well, they rented a tiny store on State Street. When they opened the doors, they had no beds. They had no overnight accommodations. They had literally no food to offer.
Wait, really? No food?
Nothing. They literally just had 40 backless wooden benches and prayer. That was the entirety of the program.
Just backless benches? Think about the physical discomfort of sitting on a backless wooden bench when you were completely exhausted, malnourished, and coming off an intense alcohol bender.
It sounds miserable.
It does. But at that time, the primary demographic they were targeting was the classic Skid Row alcoholic, the single, isolated man whose life had been derailed purely by alcohol abuse.
And that really was the defining archetype for decades in these missions. But as the 20th century progressed, the landscape of urban poverty underwent a catastrophic shift.
The problems got much deeper.
Much deeper. The missions began to realize that simple alcoholism was often just the surface symptom. Underneath, they were increasingly dealing with untreated, severe mental health disorders. And that was compounded eventually by the introduction of synthetic drugs, heroin, and eventually crack cocaine. A bowl of soup and a wooden bench were no longer going to cut it.
Yeah, to really capture the sheer scale of this evolution, the source material looks at the perspective of a guy named Mickey Coleman. He ran the Bridgeport Rescue Mission in Connecticut.
Mickey's backstory is intense.
Oh, it's wild. He grew up around a bar that his father owned, developed a severe chemical dependency, ended up selling drugs, and actually had a hit put out on his life.
Wow.
Yeah. He finally hit bottom and got clean in a mission in Stockton, California, way back in 1963. So Mickey remembers exactly what the old school missions looked like, and he contrasts that with what he eventually had to build in Bridgeport.
Mickey paints a really vivid picture of the 1960s mission. He described them as basic storefronts, maybe housing 5 or 10 guys who just stayed there to help run the place.
Very bare bones.
Totally. The operational model was incredibly simple. They fed you, they held a Bible study, and the overarching goal was purely to feed and save. It was an environment almost exclusively catering to alcoholics.
Right. And what about harder drugs?
Well, Mickey pointed out that back then, men dealing with harder drug addictions rarely even came to the missions. There were significant government grants flowing into secular drug rehabs at the time. The missions simply didn't have the sophisticated medical or psychological tools to handle complex drug withdrawals.
But then you fast forward to the modern facility Mickey helped run in Bridgeport, and the contrast is unbelievable. We aren't talking about storefronts and backless benches anymore.
Not even close.
They operate an intensely orchestrated, strictly planned agenda. They utilize a comprehensive 12-step chemical dependency curriculum that was originally developed by a Christian psychological hospital in Texas.
They have dedicated computerized learning centers now.
And they require an enormous commitment. They actually ask men to commit to a full 1-year in-house residential program, 1 entire year of your life.
That's huge.
And the boundaries are absolute. If you get frustrated and walk out the front door, you can't just sleep on the street for a weekend and stroll back into your warm bed on Monday. If you leave, you lose your spot. And if you want back in, you start from day 1, level 1.
That level of rigor is a monumental shift for the missions. And it was a necessary evolution to combat a very specific historical criticism of the rescue mission model.
Ah, right, the academic criticism.
Yeah. For a long time, academic sociologists viewed these missions with sheer contempt. In the early 1970s, researchers like Howard Barr wrote extensively about the phenomenon of the mission stiff.
The mission stiff.
Yeah, this was a highly cynical view of the homeless man who effectively prostitutes his time to the mission. The idea was that the man sits through a sermon he absolutely doesn't believe in, enduring the religious lecture as a transactional payment for a hot meal and a cot, and then he leaves the next morning completely unchanged.
The soup in a sermon stereotype. And honestly, looking at the early 1900s model, the academics kind of had a point. I mean, if all you offer is a transactional meal, you aren't actually rehabilitating anyone.
No, you're just maintaining them.
Exactly. You're just keeping them alive long enough to drink again tomorrow. So the evolution into these massive, computerized, year-long programs was essentially a survival mechanism for the missions themselves.
Exactly. Because when the psychiatric hospitals were deinstitutionalized in the 1970s and 80s, thousands of individuals with profound, untreated schizophrenia and bipolar disorder were effectively dumped right onto the city sidewalks.
It was a massive crisis.
And then the crack epidemic hit, introducing a level of neurological addiction that simple alcohol detox protocols couldn't even touch. The independent missions looked at their specific neighborhoods and realized that if their mandate was to actually rescue people, offering a cot and a bowl of soup was practically negligent.
They had to step up.
They were forced to professionalize. They had to integrate psychological frameworks, strict behavioral boundaries, and vocational training, while simultaneously trying to protect their core spiritual identity.
Now, because they are so fiercely independent, how they actually integrated those professional frameworks looks wildly different depending on which city you visit. And this is where we see the absolute extreme ends of the spectrum.
Yeah, the contrast here is amazing.
You have some missions operating literally like secular corporate boardrooms, and others operating like ancient monastic boot camps. Let's look at the boardroom approach first, up in Syracuse, New York.
The Syracuse Rescue Mission Alliance, under the leadership of Chaz Parker, is just a fascinating case study in adopting secular corporate philosophy. Parker was an executive who came in having previously managed a $3.2 million budget and a staff of 130 at a ministry down in Florida.
So he knows how to run a big ship.
He absolutely does. And when he took over in Syracuse, he didn't just tweak the Bible studies. He imported entirely secular management theories, most notably the total quality management, or TQM, concepts that were pioneered by Edward Deming.
Okay, let's unpack Edward Deming for a second, because that is a wild crossover. Deming was an American engineer and statistician. His theories were famously used to rebuild the Japanese manufacturing sector after World War II.
Right, car manufacturing.
Yeah. It's all about continuous feedback loops, statistical quality control, eliminating systemic errors, and viewing every single part of an organization as a measurable process. So applying the philosophy used to manufacture Toyota Corollas to the rehabilitation of homeless addicts in upstate New York is a massive philosophical leap.
It is a massive leap, but Parker leaned into it fully. Under this TQM model, the language of the mission completely shifted. They stopped using terms like inmates or wayfarers and started talking about stakeholders and transparency.
Very corporate jargon.
Completely. Parker focused heavily on establishing formal partnerships and dialogue with county government programs. It operated with the sleek, metric-driven efficiency of a modern, progressive, nonprofit organization, really aiming to integrate seamlessly with the existing secular social safety net.
So that's the corporate boardroom approach.
Yeah.
But then you drive over to Grand Rapids, Michigan, to Mel Trotter Ministries. It's run by a man named Tom Lehman. And the contrast literally gives you whiplash.
Oh, it's night and day.
Lehman's approach is intense, unapologetic fundamentalist evangelism. He completely rejects the idea of just being a social service agency.
Lehman's operational philosophy is driven by a stark, almost terrifying view of eternal stakes. He argues that the physical needs of a person, while incredibly urgent, are ultimately secondary to their spiritual crisis.
His perspective is really hardcore.
It is. His defining quote is incredibly blunt. He asks, "What good is it if I feed someone but in the process leave him to go to hell?" From his perspective, if a mission provides a man with food and clothing but fails to confront him with the gospel, the mission is actually acting as a detriment to that man's soul. Lehman believes that treating the symptoms of poverty while ignoring the disease of sin makes you an infidel.
And he builds his entire rehabilitative structure around that intense belief. Lehman designed a program that demands 48 hours a week of structured classes, counseling, and learning center time.
48 hours. That's more than a full-time job.
Exactly. He specifically designed it to be exhausting, operating on the premise that a man with free time on his hands in early recovery will inevitably find the wrong path. Idle hands, basically.
Right.
But the cornerstone of this curriculum, the thing that really caught my attention in the reading, is level 1 of his program. The primary requirement for a man coming off the street is to study the book of Proverbs. They have to read one new chapter every single day.
Because there are 31 chapters, it perfectly aligns with a month.
Yes. The men read the chapter, write a detailed journal entry about how the ancient passages reflect their current life choices, and then they have to debate it in group discussion.
Lehman defends this hyper-focus on biblical text by diagnosing his incoming population as suffering from what he calls post-Christian heathenism.
Post-Christian heathenism. What does that mean practically?
He argues that modern men arriving at the mission are no longer just rebelling against a moral code they grew up with. They simply never had one to begin with. They lack even a rudimentary understanding of cause and effect ethics.
So they don't even know the rules they are breaking.
Exactly. So he uses the book of Proverbs, which is essentially a collection of ancient pragmatic wisdom literature, detailing the inevitable consequences of foolish versus wise actions as a foundational ethics course. It's a way of saying, if you continue down this road, history and scripture guarantee this specific outcome.
Okay, I have to push back on Lehman's framing here, or at least look at what he is functionally doing versus what he claims to be doing.
Let's hear it.
You take a guy whose brain chemistry is absolutely fried from a decade of substance abuse.
Yeah.
His impulse control is completely non-existent. You pull him off the street, put him in a highly structured environment, and force him to read a text every single day.
Right.
You make him write in a journal, forcing him to identify his destructive thought patterns, analyze his impulsive behaviors, and evaluate the consequences of his actions. Wait a minute. Tom Lehman can call that biblical discipleship all he wants, but functionally, isn't he just administering an intense 30-day course of cognitive behavioral therapy disguised as a Bible study?
That's a fascinating observation.
I mean, he is forcing neuroplasticity. He is making these men rewire their daily habits through structured reflection. It's CBT.
You're touching on a phenomenal tension there, and it's actually a critique that Lehman himself doesn't entirely reject. He simply flips the hierarchy.
How so?
When challenged on whether his intense biblical approach is just masking psychological intervention, Lehman essentially says, no, psychology is just catching up to the Bible.
Oh, it's clever.
Yeah. He argues that secular social workers and psychologists are merely rediscovering and operationally defining behavioral truths that have been embedded in the church for millennia. He maintains that the 31 chapters of Proverbs contain a sufficient, comprehensive framework for directing human behavior and managing impulses, entirely independent of modern psychiatric terminology.
And Lehman actually uses a really evocative analogy to defend using an ancient religious text over a modern psychological workbook.
The Grand Canyon analogy, really.
Yes. He compares reading a secular self-help book or a thriller, like a Tom Clancy novel, to reading the Bible. You might read a thriller once, get the information, see how it ends, and put it on a shelf forever.
You're done with it.
Right. But he likens reading Proverbs to looking at the Grand Canyon. If you look at the canyon at 6 a.m., the shadows make it look one specific way. If you look again at 4 p.m., the changing light reveals entirely different depths and colors.
Because the perspective shifts.
Exactly. Lehman argues the text works the exact same way. If a man reads a proverb on Tuesday when he's feeling totally stable, it means one thing. If he reads that exact same proverb on Friday when his old dealer just called him and his anxiety is absolutely spiking, a specific verse might suddenly illuminate his situation and give him the cognitive framework to say no.
It's a mechanism for continuous ethical reflection. Whether a secular observer categorizes it as cognitive behavioral therapy or Lehman categorizes it as divine intervention, the mechanism of action on the brain is remarkably similar.
They're doing the same work.
Yeah. It forces a pause. It interrupts the cycle of impulsive, self-destructive behavior by inserting a structured, mandatory period of accountability and reflection. It gives a man who has lived entirely on survival instinct a vocabulary to finally understand his own choices.
And as powerful as that rewiring is for men struggling with addiction, the mission soon realized that the demographics of poverty were shifting beneath their feet yet again.
It couldn't stay static.
No. As the decades passed, the face of homelessness stopped looking exclusively like the solitary male addict. The missions had to adapt to a massive influx of women and intact families. They had to completely expand the tent.
A brilliant example of this adaptation is the Union Gospel Mission in St. Paul, Minnesota. They developed this massive educational facility known as the Promise Center.
And what's crucial about the Promise Center is that it wasn't born out of some boardroom strategic planning session.
No, it was entirely demand-driven from the ground up.
Right. The mission was running a club for young girls, and the single mothers of those girls approached the staff and essentially said, hey, you are doing great work with our daughters, but what about us? We need skills so we can actually get jobs and support them.
It was pure grassroots demand for economic empowerment. So the mission staff listened. They went out and partnered with IBM to secure a donation of typewriters. They partnered with a local vocational school and Crown College to actually build an accredited curriculum.
What started as a few mothers asking for help evolved into an incredibly rigorous 8-month, 30-credit business study program.
30 credits. That's a full year of college.
Yeah, these women weren't just getting a hot meal. They were learning Microsoft Word, advanced business procedures, Office English, and professional networking. They were building a sustainable, real-world off-ramp from systemic poverty.
But here's the critical analytical point about that: executing a program of that caliber, negotiating corporate partnerships with massive entities like IBM, securing formal college accreditation, and managing complex adult education curriculums that requires a level of executive, logistical, and managerial skill that far exceeds the capabilities of a traditional storefront charity.
You can't run a 30-credit vocational campus with just good intentions and a backless bench.
Absolutely not. You need elite executive talent. And this necessity gave rise to a really fascinating demographic phenomenon within the mission world. It's the influx of what the source calls the corporate expatriates.
The corporate expatriates. These are the profiles that absolutely fascinated me because they completely upend our cultural assumptions about who runs homeless shelters.
Oh, totally. We assume it's just volunteers.
Right. Take Rebecca Moore, for example, working at the Schenectady mission. She is a graduate of a highly prestigious boarding school and Vassar College. She recognized the immense privilege and the massive social and educational capital she possessed.
And what does she do with it?
She decided the highest and best use of those assets wasn't making millions on Wall Street, but leading a multi-million-dollar fund drive to expand a rescue mission.
Or consider Jonathan Capp at the City Union Mission in Kansas City. Capp was this rising star in the secular corporate world. Right out of college, he was recruited into a high-level management program and successfully ran a multi-million-dollar retail operation.
He had the perfect trajectory for massive corporate success.
But he walked away from it. He described a profound incongruence between his corporate career path and his internal values. He abandoned the retail empire just to manage the physical facilities and logistics of a rescue mission.
And then there's Marjorie Edmond Lloyd at Gospel Rescue Ministries in Washington, D.C. She literally walked away from a highly lucrative career at IBM. Her rationale is just stunning to me.
What did she say?
She said, for me, being a Christian is different from being a capitalist. I think when your goal is to work for the American dream, you are not focusing on the plan that God would have for your life.
That is a massive paradigm shift.
It is so wild to think about that in the context of our modern culture. We are all out here agonizing over the next promotion, fighting tooth and nail for the corner office, stressing over our 401ks, the entire machinery of the American dream.
Right, the rat race.
And here you have these brilliant executives who climbed to the absolute peak of that mountain, looked around, and said, actually, I think I'd rather manage a homeless shelter. It forces a complete reevaluation of how we measure a successful life.
It is a radical rejection of baseline cultural values. And if we connect this all the way back to segment 1, this phenomenon of the corporate expatriate is the ultimate modern fulfillment of John Wesley's original mandate.
The forced proximity.
Yes. Wesley demanded that the wealthy, the incipient capitalists, redirect their resources and their skills toward the most marginalized. These executives are doing exactly that. They are liquidating their corporate prestige and deploying their high-level logistical and managerial skills to ensure these independent missions survive in an incredibly complex regulatory and economic environment.
Okay, so you have these brilliant, highly efficient corporate minds designing the architecture and managing the logistics of these multi-million-dollar campuses. You might expect the day-to-day culture inside to feel cold or clinical and bureaucratic.
Like visiting the DMV or an HR department.
Right, but the reality on the ground, face-to-face with the guests, is surprisingly intimate. It's built on a concept of radical hospitality that actively seeks to strip away that whole institutional feel.
We see a masterclass in this approach back at the City Mission of Schenectady, orchestrated by Tyrone Lynch. He's their chaplain and director of urban ministries.
Lynch looked at the traditional historical model of the mission evening meal and realized it was actually psychologically damaging.
Yeah, historically, missions were notorious for the transactional meal. They forced starving, exhausted men to sit through a mandatory hour-long sermon before they were allowed to take a single bite of food.
Which is brutal.
Lynch recognized that this practice wasn't just ineffective, it was actively building resentment. He noted that guests were exhausted. Forcing them to endure an abundance of preaching while their blood sugar was crashing only made them despise the message.
So Tyrone completely re-engineers the environment. He cuts the mandatory devotion down to a tight 5 to 7 minutes. But the real genius is what he does with the physical space of the dining room.
He eliminates the chow line entirely.
Yes. Think about the psychology of a chow line. You are standing in a queue, holding a plastic tray, waiting for someone behind a sneeze guard to slop food onto your plate. It completely reinforces your status as an institutionalized dependent.
It's demoralizing.
It is. Tyrone abolishes that. He sets the tables beforehand with real plates and drinks. When the guests arrive, he physically stands at the door, shakes their hands, looks them in the eye, and learns their names.
That personal touch.
The guests sit down, and the food is brought to them. Tyrone literally tells them, if you need anything, just raise your hand, kind of like flagging the waiter down.
He is deliberately mirroring the experience of dining in a restaurant.
It is profound. If someone has spent the last 24 hours surviving on the concrete, treated as invisible or as a nuisance by every single person who walked past them, forcing them to earn their food by enduring a lecture is almost cruel.
It strips their dignity.
By treating them like a patron at a nice restaurant, Tyrone is performing a psychological intervention. He is restoring their fundamental human dignity before he ever addresses the state of their soul. They are allowed to sit, to be served, and to be treated as worthy of respect simply for existing.
That restoration of dignity is the core tenet of what the missions call incarnational Christianity. Another leader in Schenectady, Al Tompkins, explains this as the necessity of reaching out to the community in whatever specific form the community is willing to accept.
Not just forcing a model on them.
Exactly. It is the rejection of the grand, impersonal sermon from a pulpit. Incarnational Christianity means taking traumatized teenagers to McDonald's just to sit in a booth and listen to them. It means spending a Saturday raking leaves in a blighted neighborhood or helping a family move a couch.
It's intensely relational charity. It requires the giver to be physically and emotionally present.
But, and this is a massive but, that intense relational approach does not mean there are no rules. In fact, true relational rehabilitation requires incredibly strict boundaries.
Yeah, let's talk about Kalamazoo.
Over at the Kalamazoo Gospel Mission in Michigan, we meet Kevin Munn. He's the director of the men's ministry. And he conducts face-to-face, highly structured entry interviews for every single person requesting an overnight stay.
He isn't just handing out blankets unconditionally.
No, he is conducting a full triage assessment. He is actively screening for severe mental illness. If he identifies a psychiatric crisis, he doesn't just let them sleep it off in a corner. He coordinates immediately with the local VA hospital or Catholic Family Services.
So he integrates the care.
He forces the integration of care to avoid duplicating services and to get the person the exact clinical help they need.
And that structured, boundary-driven approach heavily dictates their internal curriculum, too. Munn facilitates a specific class at the mission simply titled Boundaries.
Which is brilliant.
When you consider the context, a room full of individuals recovering from profound addiction and trauma, teaching a class on boundaries is a very high-level psychological intervention.
What kind of things do they cover?
They tackle incredibly complex issues. They teach healthy sexuality and how to maintain safe relationships with the opposite sex. They confront the systemic issue of codependency, which is rampant in addicted populations. But most importantly, they teach what the mission describes as a radical concept for this demographic. They teach that saying no is okay.
Wow.
I cannot overstate how revolutionary that is for someone coming off the streets. If you are in early recovery from addiction, your old peer group, the people you used with, the people who know your triggers, they're constantly going to try and pull you back into that world.
They'll ask for favors, ask for money.
They will show up at your front door. Munn says the goal is to teach these individuals that blindly helping someone, or caving to their demands isn't always good. Teaching a recovering addict that they have the personal agency and the moral right to set a hard boundary and say no to their old life is literally a life-saving psychological tool.
If we synthesize what is happening in Schenectady and Kalamazoo, we see the complete abandonment of transactional charity. They have realized that trading a meal for a sermon is totally useless. They have embraced relational charity.
It works.
By systematically restoring dignity through restaurant-style service and simultaneously providing the psychological armor of boundaries training, these missions slowly dismantle the defensive walls of people who have been utterly traumatized by street survival.
And here is the ultimate paradox of this entire system. Because these independent missions are so incredibly agile, and because they offer this intense, 24/7, highly individualized relational care, they actually become the most attractive partners for the largest, most rigid bureaucracy in the country.
The United States federal government.
Which creates some incredibly strange, pragmatic bedfellows.
It really does. The catalyst for these partnerships is the ongoing crisis within the American justice system. State and federal prisons are perpetually overburdened. In response, the system is constantly looking for alternative sentencing options, trying to parole nonviolent offenders or divert people away from maximum security facilities.
But the government faces a logistical nightmare. When you parole a chronic drug offender, a petty thief, or a sex worker who has been cycling through the system for a decade, where exactly do you send them?
The government knows its own limitations. A parole officer with a caseload of 100 people cannot provide the minute-by-minute, 24/7 relational accountability and psychological support that a recovering addict needs to avoid relapsing.
Bureaucracy is too massive and too sterile.
Right. But the local rescue missions are built precisely for that level of care. And the source material highlights this incredible, almost surreal story from Washington, D.C., involving a property known as the Fulton House of Hope.
Oh, the murder hotel.
Yes. The physical building was this landmark 1860s structure that had severely decayed. It had devolved into a notorious murder hotel. It was functioning as a violent hub for prostitution and crack cocaine distribution.
A completely blighted property.
Totally. The Justice Department eventually raided and seized the building under a federal initiative known as the Weed and Seed Program. The concept being that law enforcement weeds out the violent crime, and then the government seeds something positive into the vacuum to revitalize the neighborhood.
The problem with the seed phase was that the building was practically falling apart. The walls were crumbling, and the footprint was entirely too small to attract any serious corporate real estate developer.
The government held a seized crack house that nobody wanted.
So in 1998, in a pure act of administrative pragmatism, the Justice Department allowed the local gospel rescue ministries to purchase this former murder hotel for a mere $27,000.
Which is pennies for real estate in D.C.
Exactly, yeah. The mission took this physical monument to violence and addiction, gutted it, and transformed it into a dedicated rehabilitation home for women. It stands as the ultimate physical manifestation of the symbiotic link between federal law enforcement and local faith-based missions.
But if you really want to understand how this system rehabilitates a human mind, you have to look at the story of Earl.
Earl's story is the absolute best part of this whole deep dive.
It is a masterclass in human resilience and the failure of standardized education. So Earl was an African-American man living at the D.C. mission who had been battling a brutal, severe cocaine addiction.
Okay.
He enters the missions program, he submits to the boundaries, and he finally gets clean. But Earl is deeply self-aware. He knows his brain has been chemically altered by the drugs, and he knows he has an incredibly short attention span.
Sitting in a classroom for hours is physical torture for him.
And this presents a massive hurdle because the mission's primary vocational off-ramp at the time was a class designed to help men pass the written exams to attain a commercial driver's license, a CDL.
Which is a huge deal. Securing a CDL is a golden ticket out of poverty. It basically guarantees a solid middle-class income driving trucks.
It does, but the technical manuals are dense, dry, and incredibly complex. The mission had structured the class to run for 6 to 8 weeks.
6 to 8 weeks of classroom study for a guy with a severely compromised attention span in early recovery is an absolute eternity. It is a recipe for failure.
So Earl, completely frustrated, actually complains to the instructor. He tells him the class is too long, too drawn out, and impossible to focus on.
And the instructor does something brilliant. He doesn't coddle Earl, and he doesn't kick him out of the program. He challenges him. He looks at Earl and says, If you think you can find a better way to teach this material, then you do it.
And Earl accepts the challenge. He completely deconstructs the CDL manual.
He absolutely hacks the system. Earl sits down and analyzes his own cognitive limitations. He figures out entirely new, rapid-fire methods of absorbing and retaining the technical information.
Using his customized study methods, Earl takes the exam and passes all 5 required CDL tests in just 2 days.
2 days? That's insane.
But he doesn't stop there. He takes his new methodology and completely rewrites the mission's CDL curriculum. He takes this grueling 8-week academic slog and compresses it into a highly focused, intense, rapid-fire class designed specifically for men whose brains work exactly like his.
And the outcome is staggering. Using his curriculum, Earl achieves a 100% pass rate for the men he teaches. 100%.
If we zoom out and look at the macro implications of Earl's story, it perfectly encapsulates why the government desperately needs these independent missions.
Let's tie it all together.
When the Bush administration proposed funding faith-based initiatives back in 2001, the critics were legitimately terrified of breaching the constitutional wall between church and state.
Which we discussed at the top of the show.
Right. But the reality on the asphalt is completely pragmatic and wonderfully messy. A sterile government bureaucracy simply cannot engineer a scenario where the Department of Justice hands a seized crack house over to a street chaplain to rebuild a neighborhood.
It would take years of red tape.
Exactly. And a standardized Department of Education curriculum cannot adapt quickly enough for a former crack addict to hack the pedagogical system and become a master teacher for his peers.
The massive secular agencies rely on the relational flexibility and the street-level credibility of the missions to accomplish the nuanced human rehabilitation that the government is structurally incapable of doing. Earl's story demands such profound respect. He didn't just survive a system built for people without cognitive deficits. He completely re-engineered that system to save the guys coming up right behind him. It completely flips the cultural script on who possesses the capacity to be an expert or an educator in our society.
It proves an undeniable sociological truth. Proximity to the problem almost always generates the most effective solutions. Earl understood the exact cognitive load, the specific anxieties, and the exact learning deficits of his peers infinitely better than a credentialed, master's-level educator from outside the community ever could. The mission simply provided the flexible container for his genius to operate.
Okay, let's take a breath and synthesize this incredible evolution we've been tracking.
It's been quite a journey.
It really has. We started in the 1700s, picturing John Wesley standing in the open fields, confronting polite society and demanding that the wealthy engage with the destitute through the physical proximity of social holiness.
Right, closing that gap.
We moved to the 1800s, watching an ex-convict like Jerry McCauley wash men in the Fourth Ward with nothing but backless wooden benches and prayer.
The absolute bare minimum of resources.
And we tracked how those austere, localized efforts were forced to evolve, adapting to the devastation of deinstitutionalization and crack cocaine, morphing into multi-million-dollar rehabilitative campuses. Campuses run by corporate expatriates from IBM, featuring computerized learning centers, intensely debated boundaries training, and rapid-fire CDL classes designed by the very addicts they are trying to save.
And the ultimate takeaway for you, the listener, regardless of whether you view this through a deeply religious lens or a purely secular sociological one, is the sheer operational genius of the model.
It really is brilliant.
These autonomous hyperlocal rescue missions offer a definitive masterclass in how to address complex, compound human crises. They succeed where others fail because they combine unwavering restaurant-style dignity with incredibly strict behavioral boundaries and highly individualized, relentless care.
It is a model that absolutely refuses to reduce a human life to a statistic on a monthly government report. They demand that you look at the whole person.
Which leaves us with a final, highly provocative concept to wrestle with. The historical and sociological evidence we've explored today strongly suggests that these rescue missions effectively act as the social conscience of modern capitalism.
The social conscience. I like that.
They represent the rare physical intersection where the incredibly wealthy and the utterly destitute are forced to meet face-to-face and acknowledge each other's humanity. If these fiercely independent, faith-driven, highly adaptable missions were to somehow vanish tomorrow, what purely secular government institution could possibly replicate that intense 24/7 relational rehabilitation without instantly devolving into just another overwhelmed, sterile bureaucracy? Think deeply about that the next time you walk past a local mission in your city.
That is a phenomenal question to leave hanging in the air. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. We hope it gave you a completely new, multifaceted perspective on the complex, messy, and profoundly beautiful work happening right in the gritty heart of our cities. Until next time, keep exploring and keep asking the hard questions.